Hi, welcome to the third episode of Tuts version 2. In this episode we're going to cover the event emitter pattern. The callback pattern, which I covered on the previous episode, is useful when you are issuing granular I/O simple operations that either fail or succeed. But if you have an object that is a bit more complex, like a TCP connection or a TCP server, you may want to perform some actions when the connection is opened, when it's closed, when some data arrives, or when there is an error. This pattern is sometimes known as pub/sub, where there is an event publisher and 0 or more event subscribers. Here, in the event emitter pattern, the principles are similar, but the names change a bit. There is the event emitter part, which generates the events, and there is the event listeners, which listen to events. Here is a simple example of a simple TCP server. Here we're using several event emitters. First, here we're creating a server calling net.createServer, and the server itself is an event emitter. The server emits connection events, and here we're setting up registering a listener for the connection event. So we're using emitter.on event type and then pass in an event listener, which is a function. This callback function may get event type specific data, as is the case of this con object. And this con object is an event emitter on its own. It's of type net.socket, which can emit, among others, data, close, and end events. Okay, so let's test the server. So let's launch it. Node TCP server. The server, as you can see on the end, listens to port 8080, and then we can connect to it. Localhost port 8080. Okay, so we're connected, and you can see on the server logs says IP address with port blah blah blah, connected, and then we can type a bit, send some data, so it's logging that it's got some data. Then we can do Control-C to end the connection, and you can see that it got closed, the connection got closed. The event type is represented by a string, which is usually a lowercase and containing only letters, as is the example of data, end, close, and error events. Each event type passes some arguments to the listeners, and these arguments are specific to the event type. Some documentation should be provided about which arguments the listeners for this event type should expect. For instance, the error event expects an error as the first and sole argument. Data event expects a buffer or a string of data. The end event on a connection or the close don't expect any argument. In the case of the server, the TCP server, the server connection event type expects a net.socket object as the sole argument. The event listener is just a simple JavaScript function. Either it is declared inline, like in these examples, or declared in advance. So inline here would be something like this, and declared in advanced. In advanced, you'd move the function out and call it a name, for instance, and pass it the name of the function as the argument. Also, you can have more than one event listener for the same event type. For instance, you have your data handler, but you could have another data handler, and you can register that handler too. So both of them would be called in the instance of a data event. If some of the events will happen only once, at most once, or if you're interested in the first instance of that event, you should use the .once instead of .on. So we can do this, for instance, for the end event. So we expect the end event to happen once, and the close event to happen only once. After it's registered, you can remove an event listener for the event emitter by calling remove listener, passing in the event type and event listener. For instance, if you wanted to, for some reason, unregister the data event handler sometime in the future, for instance, that we only listen for the first 5 seconds of data, you could do something like set timeout, and after 5 seconds, we could say con.remove listener and remove this data handler. So we'd get the event only the first 5 seconds. Got some data here, but doesn't get any data anymore because we just unregistered the event listener. The event type is just a meaningless identifier that's used by the event emitter to dispatch events. This identifier is meaningless with honorable exception of the error event type. If any event of the type error occurs and the event listener has listeners for it, everything goes as planned. The listener or listeners are invoked. But if there are no event listeners for when that error event occurs, there is an uncapped exception is thrown into the event loop. So you can still catch errors for if you want register for the global uncaught exception event type emitted by the process. So you do process.on. Process is also an event emitter. Uncaught exception, uncaught exception, and then you pass here an error, and then you get error and process.exit. We should exit afterwards. So the usage of the process uncaught exception handler is not really advised for things other than logging, since the error you get here is not contextualized, and you may have left a series of resources unattended for instance, open connection, hanging requests, etc. So as a rule of thumb, you should always listen for the error events on every event emitter that you care about. For instance, if you remove the listener for the error event here, and then as we get some data, we just emit some error, let's try this. So we got an uncaught exception saying here something awful has happened, and the process exits as we intended. So if we had something like con dot on error, function error as we had. We can, for instance, terminate the connection, try to write something and the connection could do this like this. So there's an error and the connection ends. So this way, by handling the error, somehow we made sure that our resources were cleaned. So this is all for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. See you soon. Bye bye.